Hey guys, this is Crafterman, and even though the Green Plateau series is still technically over, this is one of my last videos, and it'll be the timeline of the entire Green Plateau world. Now, I've said many times before that the Minecraft world did not begin when us players first started joining it. It had actually existed for thousands of Minecraft years before that. So this video will be a timeline of everything, from the moment the first Minecraft alpha code generated up until the present. So, in the beginning, there really wasn't much of anything. This was just the first alpha proto Minecraft code that ever generated, and it just generated randomly in the dawn of the computer era, somewhere in the midst of cyberspace. Now, remember, the Minecraft years don't really correspond to human years, but you can always see what the Minecraft year is up here. So in the beginning there was nothing. It was just a piece of code floating around cyberspace. But over the course of the next few hundred years, the code began to stabilize, sort of. It began to stabilize by building firewalls to protect itself from the void of cyberspace. Firewalls that today we know as bedrock. Now, this bedrock was what separated the void of cyberspace from the actual world that the alpha code had created. And soon, the entire code was covered in this bedrock. So now there's a world, but there's nothing in it. It's just bedrock, and layers of bedrock keep on forming. But eventually there were so many layers of bedrock underneath that the layers on top didn't really need to be so protective anymore. So they actually began to soften up, some of them, into what today we call stone. Now this stone was pretty cool. It was kind of like bedrock, but it was softer, like you could break it. I mean, you could, but no one was alive to do anything yet, so no one really did. But yeah, soon it was stone that began to cover the entire world. And then the alpha code took it one step further, by making wood. Wood was even softer than stone, but there was something else about this wood. It was very flexible in that it could be transformed, or rather, crafted, into other things. Again, it could, but there's no one alive to craft anything yet, and crafting tables haven't even been discovered. So yeah. But then, nonetheless, wood began to cover the world. So now there are 3 layers covering the entire world. Wood on the top, stone underneath, and bedrock at the bottom. But the thing with wood is that it can burn. It just, sometimes wood would get struck by lightning and it would start fires. But you know, like all that flexibility that wood has, the ability to create other stuff? Well, that concept, that code of that concept, was broken down by the fire whenever it did burn, and whenever there was a large pit where fire had been, all that code accumulated into what we today call dirt. Dirt had the concept of wood, that it can create other stuff. Well, the thing with dirt is that it's not dirt itself that can be made into other stuff, but dirt has the power to grow other things in it, like plants. So that's how the first grass eventually grew. And one day, a new block formed. It was the softest, most flexible block of all, made of pure life energy from all the grass and stuff that was around it. It was called wool. And some of the wool got so energetic with life energy from all the life around it and stuff, that it actually turned into a real animated creature called a sheep. It was made out of wool, but it could move around and stuff. And what's really cool about sheep is if there's 2 of them, and they both eat grass, then they can actually breed with each other and make even more sheep. So sheep soon began to spread around the world, except they had to stay near the grassy patches, because that's where their food was. But nonetheless, they began to spread over the entire world. And eventually the sheep began to evolve separately. Some of the sheep were different than others. Some of the sheep stayed as white sheep, but there were other color sheep too. And eventually these other color sheep evolved into completely different animals altogether. The gray sheep evolved into wolves, the red sheep evolved into pigs, the brown sheep evolved into cows, and the pink sheep evolved into villagers. So yeah, these animals could do some stuff. They could build stuff out of the wood that was everywhere, like makeshift shelters and stuff. But it wasn't, no one really made anything really creative until one day a villager named Ran discovered the first crafting table. He made it by combining 4 blocks of wood together. Now this crafting table was revolutionary, because using the crafting table, you can use the wood around you to make really cool tools that you can use to mine stone to make even cooler tools. So soon all the villagers that he told about this were able to make some really cool stuff. Like, they were able to make houses out of stone, and tools out of stone too, and they were able to use those stone tools to gather dirt and make farms and stuff. And unfortunately, since the villagers became the dominant race because they had all this cool stuff, they enslaved all the other animals too for their resources. And there was really nothing the animals could do about it because the villagers had all the stuff. But this was kind of the way it worked for over the course of the next few thousand years. Villagers built stuff everywhere around the world, and soon it looked like this. Well, not soon, like thousands of years later. Year 4000 kind of looked like this, and the villagers kept continuing to make new stuff, new, better tools, discovering more, like, cool blocks and stuff everywhere. And the village, well, and they kept developing more and more. Now, it would kind of be what we today call like an endless village, because the reason villages look like this is because from these times villagers learned to build this way. So it was kind of like an endless village, but there's no nature in between it because nature hasn't been invented yet. But yeah, eventually the village got so developed that the alpha code couldn't sustain it any longer, and eventually the alpha code started to collapse. Now, I actually witnessed this in episode 100 of Green Plateau. I went back in time to the year 5125, and I was able to witness this myself. But yeah, when the alpha code collapsed, the remains were, just by chance, picked up by a group of dogs that were currently enslaved, just like all the other animals, by the villagers. And the remains that they picked up from the alpha code gave them godly-like powers. They were able to do amazing things. But they couldn't let the villagers see them do it because the villagers would kill them immediately if they found out that the dogs were dangerous. But what the dogs did was they created a secret underground world where they made some really cool stuff like plants and trees, which would one day become like the first nature. They created lots of stuff in their secret underground world, which today is called the Nether. It wasn't all fiery yet, that came later. But yeah, once they were confident that they were ready, they laid waste to the villagers above. A lot of it got flooded completely, which they did with their godly powers and stuff, and the parts of it that were too high up to get flooded were burned down. But remember what happens when wood burns. When it burns for a long period of time, it eventually turns into dirt. So as the village burned down, it left behind dirt everywhere around the entire world, and the parts that had been flooded became the world's first oceans. And the nature that the dogs had created in their other underground world spread to the entire world. So that's how nature was created. So nature in Minecraft actually didn't exist until the year 5125. So yeah, that's basically how the world was created. So now I'm going to move up to I'm going to stop doing the slideshow and start explaining stuff on a map. So now the dogs were in charge. Sort of. I mean, they had godly powers and all, but their only intention was to prevent the villagers from ever rising to power again. So they took some land for themselves and called it Kenaya. And they also controlled some of the land just to keep an eye on the villagers that lived there to make sure they stayed nomadic and didn't start building up their huge villagey thing again. Well, they only occupied half the world because they didn't know about the north yet. So the south half was occupied by Kenaya. But the north half was completely free for the villagers to do whatever they want. So anyway, the water from the oceans, now that there are oceans everywhere, began to evaporate and rain down upon the land into what is now lakes and rivers and stuff. So yeah, back to the villagers and stuff. So right now, everyone's nomadic, just living freely in the newfound nature of the world. And yeah, and the villagers are doing okay. They're just surviving like all the other animals. But some of the villagers want to recreate the life that their ancestors had lived. So they had to do it in the north because the south was occupied by Kenaya. So in the north, the first ever village was created. Now this is the modern type of village we know today. It's just a small area of that village that kind of resembles the huge village that once existed. So those are the villages we know today. And soon, lots of villages began to develop throughout the north. And then, the villagers united all their villages and planned to turn the entire north into one giant village, the way they had once lived. But Kenaya was ready for this, and they stopped them from doing that. The way they stopped them is they occupied this area and put a curse on it to make it completely deadly, that anyone who entered this area would die. So that created a barrier between this half of the world and this half of the world, or at least of the villagers' world, and soon, since it was separated, it collapsed. So the villages still remained, but the villagers didn't have an empire anymore, and because of this, Kenaya no longer needed to occupy this. And they promised everyone, well, everyone who was able to hear it, that they would not use military force anymore, that Kenaya would just let the world survive on its own. So, 3 people groups began to form. They were still all nomadic, but the Westerners and Easterners were separate because this area is all poisonous and stuff, and the Southerners began to evolve separately because they had been occupied by Kenaya for so long, so they developed differently than the Westerners and Easterners, which used to be the Northerners. Get it? Alright, let's go on. So these animals were just living around freely and nomadically, just like they had always been since the village fell, and there weren't any tribes yet. Until there were. Up in the east, right over here, a group of families united into the first ever tribe, called the Stories tribe. Now this tribe was really cool because since it was a tribe and all united and with laws and everything, people didn't have to worry about protecting their stuff, so they could make a lot of really cool things, and life began to get a lot easier for them. So everyone around them began to get jealous of how well they were doing, and tried to unite into tribes of their own, but everyone was fighting for power and they couldn't do it. Also, on the top of the plateau over here, the Plata tribe formed. They formed because they were isolated from everyone else, because they were on top of the plateau. And in the west, farming is really easy because there's such fertile river valleys over here that everyone's settling near. And a farming tribe begins to form soon, called the Durlan tribe. Now, it's really good at farming, and everyone around them is buying crops from them because they're so good at farming. And it works so well for them that they begin to expand their territory beyond their original territory. Also, there's farming in the south too. 3 farming tribes form in the south. And they're having a contest to see who can attract the most nomads into their tribes. And they're also having a debate over which system of farming is better. The Surgeth tribe is doing river farming, the Krabash tribe is doing lake farming, and the Kiblak tribe is doing ocean farming. Also, the Stories tribe knows that no other tribes are going to develop around them, or at least they think so. So they feel free to occupy all the area around them and start being really mean to the people there. And the people revolt immediately. 2 rebel groups form, the Kennels and the Yongreys. The Kennels and the Yongreys both want to gain independence from the Stories, who are being real jerks occupying this area. And once they gain independence, they both plan to become independent tribes of their own, but first they need independence to be independent. Alright. So they both start fighting off the Stories tribe. But the Kennels are actually less focused on military, and they're more focused on developing their culture. But they still have to fight off the Stories, so they're not really doing so well at fighting them off. So they ask the Yongreys over here for help, in exchange for economic support once they both become independent. And the Yongreys say sure, so the Yongreys help the Kennels gain their independence. Then they both become independent into the tribes Ongria and Canalia. And then they become even bigger. Now, Canalia promised Ongria the economic support because Ongria helped them fight off the Stories. So eventually Ongria asks for it, but Canalia hesitates to give it to them, so they attack Canalia, and then Canalia has to build up a military just to fight them off. And then a bitter resentment lingers. Also, over here, the Durlan tribe isn't doing a very good job governing the new territory it took, so the new territories gain independence into the Komospesh tribe and the Navalov tribe. Also down south here, the Wenla tribe forms, and the Wenla tribe is annoying all the other 3 tribes by doing all 3 types of farming, ocean farming over here, lake farming, and river farming. And then they all attract more nomads who form tribes of their own. Over here, the Harcraft tribe just formed. It's the biggest tribe ever, and they plan to become the most powerful tribe ever too by having really cool systems of farming where everyone is assigned a job at birth, basically socialism. Also, these tribes begin to form even more tribes because they're attracting so many nomads, and then even more tribes form. The Kiblak tribe is attracting a lot of nomads too, but they're not doing a very good job integrating them, so they gain independence into the Regionala tribe and the Delo tribe. Also, remember how the Harcraft tribe supposedly knows everything about farming? Yeah, not really. It collapses. The Harcraft tribe still exists, but it doesn't have that much land left because all the other tribes gain independence. Now, the East isn't really doing so well. There's a massive famine here and everyone's starving. So they know they have to unite. So they unite into the Panlone tribe. It's a really big tribe, And the thing about this tribe is that each family can grow crops and sell it to other families, which will create competition between the families. Now, this is capitalism. So, it works for a while. The famine ends, and almost everyone has enough to eat, so it works okay. Also, these two tribes, remember how they're still having the contest to attract nomads? Well, it gets really heated and escalates into a war between the Surgeth tribe and the Varshan tribe. And no one really wins the war, it just ends in a stalemate. And then the generals that were fighting the war get to keep the land that they took, and each of the generals makes their own tribes. Now, the Panlone tribe isn't doing so well either. Since there's such fierce competition between the families, there are two families, the Ping family and the Hind family, that are dominating, and everyone else is excluded. So the people that are excluded want to gain independence. They become the Kipes, and the Panlone tries to keep them in. But the two families that are competing in the Panlone eventually turn on each other, and then the entire tribe basically falls apart and splits into three tribes. The Ping tribe, that's ruled by the Ping family, the Bai Hind tribe, that's ruled by the Hind family, and the Kipes, which were just excluded, but at least now they have their own tribe. And remember how everyone's isolated at the top of the plateau here? Well, there's not really much food at the top of the plateau, so some people go to the bottom. So the people of the Plata tribe, some of them migrate to the bottom and become the Man-Platan tribe. And it works pretty well, but the land is kind of alien to them, but they learn to use it anyway, and they occupy even more land. And then over here, in the Baihin tribe, all the poor people just had a revolution, and they made their own tribe that's going to be a democracy. Some people in the Komping tribe up here like the idea of a democracy, and almost everyone leaves the Komping tribe and becomes these two tribes instead. The Komping tribe still exists, but now it's tiny. Now remember the West. The West is all really good at farming and stuff. Well, most of the West is, but not this part. This part's like a mountain range, and there's not much food in the mountains, so everyone's always fighting each other for food. And since everyone's fighting each other for so long, only the strong survive, and now it's just mountains of fierce warriors that only survive because they were the strongest. And eventually, they all unite into a tribe, the Montaigne tribe, and it's a tribe full of fierce warriors because only the strongest had survived. But they still really don't have much food. Also, over here, the tribes finally figured out all their political differences and made peace with each other, and they begin trading with each other, and the trade becomes so successful that merchants from all over the rest of the East come over and settle here and make their own tribes over here. Also, the Trafnic nomads finally united into a tribe, the Trafnic tribe. And down here in the south, there's a bunch of people with this really weird religion. They're called the Malgazans, and they make a tribe. And they have a really weird religion, and no one likes them, but that's okay because they don't like anyone else either. Remember how the Montaigne tribe has no food? Well, since they have all these strong warriors and everything, they make a demand of all the other tribes to give them food. And Komospech over here is the first one to refuse, so the Montaigne tribe destroys them and conquers their land, and then all the other tribes don't refuse after that. They also make an alliance with the Trafnic tribe, which also has a problem getting food. You see this part of the world? There are people living here, and they're just living as nomads. They don't really have a tribe. But everywhere else around them has a tribe, and they're being excluded and, being taken advantage of because they're the only ones in the area without tribes. So they make tribes, just so they can have tribes, even though they're not really committed to those tribes. So the West and the South are both farmers, and they both have a lot of really cool farming techniques, and they're really excited to share those techniques with each other. So a tribe forms in between them, called the Anchur tribe, which is a trading tribe in between the West and the South, where they can exchange crops and farming methods with each other. And this becomes so successful that more tribes form around him. And the Rajlin tribe actually tries to steal all the trade by occupying some of this area, but it doesn't even govern it that well, and that area just gains independence anyway to two more tribes. Also, people in the Far East finally figured out how to survive. That's pretty cool, I guess. And also, the Trafnic tribe, just like the Montaigne tribe, was having a problem getting food, so they too occupy the area around them and demand food from the people over here. And remember the Malgazan tribe here that has that really weird religion? Well, there are a lot of people in the tribe who don't like the really weird religion, so they make their own tribe, where they don't have to be part of the really weird religion. So now here we are, in the year 6 to 800. There are tribes all around the world, and most of them are doing okay. But you know who's not doing okay? The dinosaurs. Yeah, there are dinosaurs in the world. But they're beginning to die out because none of the tribes are growing the food that they need, and dinosaurs eat different food than all the other animals. So, a lot of them are beginning to lose hope. But then, the dinosaurs actually exist in these 4 tribes over here, and they're united by a dinosaur named Ba Rok, who makes a pledge that he will grow all the food that the dinosaurs need to live in these 4 tribes, which are now united into the Baroque Empire, the first empire to exist among the tribes. And there are also other animals living in these tribes too. The only demand the dinosaurs that are ruling the empire make is that everyone has to grow some dinosaur food so the dinosaurs can survive. And then they conquer these tribes in the middle just so they can connect all their territory. And the people of those tribes now have to grow the dinosaur food as well. But other than that, the dinosaur government isn't actually that strict. And over here, these tribes like the idea of an empire, so they unite into the Twilight Confederacy. They also begin to heavily criticize the Baroque Empire over here, and the Baroque Empire sees them as a threat and quickly takes them over, basically. And now that they have a much longer coast, they can attract water dinosaurs from everywhere that also want food. And now they have a really strong navy from all those water dinosaurs, so they easily conquer all the tribes to the northeast. And they plan to also conquer the tribes to the southwest, but at least some of them are prepared. And these 3 tribes survive, including Malgazan tribe, which is the one that has that really weird religion. And the Baroque tribe decides to let these 3 tribes go. Doesn't really matter, they have lots of land anyway, and they're doing pretty well. Except the dinosaurs are doing well, but the citizens in the empire, like the animals that are not dinosaurs, are kind of pissed that they have to grow so much food for the dinosaurs, and they don't really want to anymore. So there's a revolution led by a man named Klaus Kohl, and they go on strike. And for a while, no one grows food. Everyone refuses to grow food for the dinosaurs. And in the matter of weeks, all the dinosaurs die out because there's no food for them. So then Klaus Kohl takes over the empire and makes a new government, the Klaus Kohl Empire. And it's now a democratic government. It's a democracy, and every citizen has a vote, supposedly. And then Klaus Kohl finally conquers all the 3 tribes that Baroque never did, and occupies this area over here as well. Now, you know how it's supposed to be like a democracy and stuff? Yeah, well, it's beginning to get really corrupt, and it's led by like one party that basically rules over everything. And a lot of the people don't really like it. Especially these people. Remember they had the Twilight Confederacy before the Baroque took them over? Well, they want a new place to be able to do what they want by themselves. So they seek refuge in these islands over here. And then Kenaya, which is led by the dogs, takes them in and gives them this land over here. This was the land that was cursed by the dogs, that no one could survive there. But then they remove the curse and give the Twilight pilgrims the land here. So now the Twilights have an empire, the Twilight Empire. And this land is what today we call the jungle. You've seen the jungle in many of my videos. Now, remember Kenaya promised to not use their military force anymore, even though they do have godly powers. But they don't like the Klaus Kohl Empire very much because they're worried that the Klaus Kohl Empire might someday conquer the entire world, and it'd be just like when the villagers ruled everything. So they asked the Twilight Empire to do their dirty work and take out the Klaus Kohl Empire. And the Twilight Empire is very gracious because of, like, the Kenaya gave them all this land. So they say okay. So the Twilight Empire develops a really strong military and takes out the Klaus Kohl Empire. Also, remember these 2 tribes, Ongria and Canalia? They've been fighting since they were formed. And they've been at a stalemate for like 1,000 years. But then one day a chicken named Phoebe comes to Canalia and teaches them lots of really cool military strategies and helps them to finally conquer Ongria at last. And then they unite into what they call the Relica Empire, and Phoebe, the chicken who helped them, is now the Empress of the Relica Empire. So the Relica Empire conquers all the land of the Far East, and they do some of it by force, but Phoebe has lots of other good ideas for survival too, and almost everyone joins the Relica Empire willingly. Except for the native Ongrians, who are in this tribe. They're very discriminated against in the Relica Empire, but there's nothing they can do about it really, because everyone's so excited about Phoebe's new, rule over the Relica Empire. There's nothing they can do for now. Now you might remember these tribes over here. The tribes that only formed because they needed a reason to have a tribe, even though they weren't committed to those tribes. But one day, a cow by the name of Distan comes to these 3 tribes and unites them. And the new empire is named after him. His idea is that since Distan has a really long coastline, that they would do a lot of trade with the western tribes over here who have lots of good farming techniques and sell the crops to the rest of the eastern tribes. And also, they would hire some of the westerners to teach them the western farming techniques, and so they could grow really cool farms in their own land. And this is really successful, and business is going great. But there's another tribe here, the Sponar tribe, that's getting really aggressive because they just conquered another tribe, the Navaket tribe. And Distan is afraid that Sponar might attack them to get access to the coastline, because the coastline is what made Distan so rich, because they were able to trade with the Westerners. And then their suspicion is true. Sponar attacks them. But then Distan forms a really good military and manages to fight off Sponar. And it works really well. With the land that they conquered from Sponar, they made even more farms, which made them even more rich and successful. Conquering was so successful that they wanted to do even more of it, so they conquer all the tribes to the south. And then, they are still hungry, they're still even more powerful now, so the Distan Empire wants to conquer all the tribes to the east as well. So they do. Well, most of them. The Man-Platin tribe manages to keep some of their land, and the Plata tribe is left alone, because remember, they're isolated at the top of the plateau. Down south, over here, the Creative nomads run wild and kill everyone, because they're mean. So the Distan Empire and the Twilight Empire team up to get rid of them, and once they do, they each get a share of the land that the Creative once roamed over. The Twilight Empire gets to keep this part, and the Distan Empire gets to keep this part. But the Distan Empire kind of feels like it's unfair. The Twilight Empire has much easier access to their share of the land because they have all these islands, and Distan is completely disconnected from this. So Distan occupies this area over here, just so they can have a path to this land. But then Relica rushes in and is like, nope. And Distan thinks that's totally not fair because this land doesn't even belong to Relica, but Relica still tries to prevent Distan from getting access to this land because Relica is actually kind of scared of Distan and doesn't want Distan to get too powerful. But that backfires because Distan invades Relica. At first Relica is kind of able to hold them off, but then the Empress dies and Distan takes over all of Relica's land. Well, except for this part, but it's not part of Relica anymore, so it has a different name. But now the Distan Empire is huge. It covers the entire east, except for a few parts, and they're really successful. They have so much farmland to grow so many cool crops, and most of the citizens of the Distan Empire are actually happy with their lives. You know who's not happy with their lives? These people. Remember, the Trafnik tribe occupied all this area and keeps robbing everyone in this area of their stuff. So a lot of them flee to the north, and they become the Borealan guerrillas. They form lots of private military groups to fight off the Trafniks. And Trafnik is an ally with Distan, so Distan tries to help them deal with the Borealan guerrillas. And Distan's army is the strongest in the world, but the land up here is very unfamiliar to them, so they fail. Even though the Distan failed over here, Distan Empire is still really strong, and has lots of really cool plans to become even stronger. But the Twilight Empire is friends with Kenaya, who doesn't want anyone to become super strong and take over the entire world. So Twilight tries to stop them from going about their plans to become super powerful. And Distan feels that this is unfair, so Distan invades Twilight, and they have a long war on many fronts. But eventually, Distan conquers the entire Twilight Empire, and goes ahead with their plans to become even more powerful. Now, Kenaya, which is where all the godly dogs live, is getting kind of nervous because Distan is completely surrounding them, and the Kenaya's friends, the Twilight Empire, is now gone. So, Kenaya can't declare war on Distan because Distan's way too powerful for that, and Kenaya's not even supposed to use military force anyway. But what they do, the godly dogs secretly weaken Distan by maybe making violent storms occur wherever Distan has farms, and maybe mess up some of Distan's communications, just to weaken them. And it works. Distan gets weaker, sort of. But Kenaya is still really nervous that one day Distan will take over the entire world. One Kenayan especially is really nervous. It's not one of the dogs, actually. It's just a normal citizen of Kenaya. His name is Ender. And supposedly he has the best plan for making sure no one ever conquers the entire world. So he goes to the dogs of Kenaya and asks for just a little piece of land so he can carry out his plan. They say sure, because they kind of don't want anyone to take over the world either. So they give him a tiny kingdom for him to call his own, in the middle of Kenaya. But Ender's plan is actually genius. His plan is to occupy in a completely different dimension. So he does. He occupies a new dimension of his own, and makes it the End, which is what we now know as the End, named after Ender, which is him. Now, this is actually the most genius military strategy ever, because since he has a dimension all to himself, no one can stop him from breeding troops to make a really strong army. But he can still spawn those troops anywhere in the overworld that he wants. So he breeds an army of monsters that he genetically engineered. These monsters are what we know today as mobs. So he occupies some land, then more land, then more land. The more land he occupies, the more he controls, the more resources get sent to the end, and the more monsters he can produce. It's an endless cycle of him becoming more and more powerful. And Kenaya's glad that now it doesn't look like anyone's going to take over the world, but they're still a bit nervous because Ender's actually going too far, more than they wanted. But Ender continues to conquer lots of stuff, and Ender forms an alliance with the Montane and Trafnic tribes to help get rid of all these tribes in the west over here. So you see how these tribes are kind of like shaded gray? That's because it's getting really hard for them to exist because Ender's laws are too strict for them. And then Ender makes the laws even stricter. Ender's law is that basically no group of animals are allowed to unite ever, just to make sure that no empire takes over the entire world. So basically it bans any form of government created by the animals, which means no tribes. So eventually Ender managed to dismantle almost all of the tribes. So Kenaya realizes that Ender is an extremist, and Kenaya doesn't really support Ender. But it's too late now because Ender is super powerful. He controls all this. And eventually a rebellion forms. There are rebel groups against Ender over here. And Distan is sort of scared of Ender, and Distan funds the rebel groups, but doesn't want to declare war on Ender immediately, because remember, Distan was weakened by Kenaya when Kenaya was scared of Distan. So yeah, the rebel groups sort of built up a pretty strong rebellion, but Ender keeps occupying more and more land, and eventually there's no hope for the rebels, and they all fade away. Almost. There's still a rebel spirit, but they can't really do anything because Ender's now too powerful. So Ender basically takes almost all of Distan's land, and Distan finally declares war on Ender. But it's too late. Ender's way too powerful, and Ender sends in some of his mobs to assassinate Emperor Distan, and the Distan Empire collapses. So now there are no tribes, except for the ones over here that are allied with Ender. And then eventually, Ender takes all of Kenaya's land too. So, Kenaya's worst fear had come true, that one day an empire would conquer the entire world. But ironically, that came to be because someone was scared that someone would one day conquer the entire world. So in the process of preventing anyone from conquering the entire world, Ender conquered the entire world. Well, for a while. Just for like about 50 years or so. But then, a new group of people formed, right over here. And it was led by a person by the name of me. Yep, now this is where the Green Plateau series began. This is where I first joined the world, and first made a little land of my own, called the Green Plateau. And it was just a really small little development at first, just for me to survive. And I had no idea that Ender wanted me out of the world anyway. I didn't even know anything about King Ender. All I noticed were that mobs kept attacking the Green Plateau. Now, the Green Plateau is counted as a civilization which broke Ender's laws, so soon Ender sent in all his goons to attack the Green Plateau, and you can see that it's shaded more gray over here. It soon became really hard to fight off Ender. Now, Ender had a policy for this stuff. He wasn't allowed to send his troops in, like, orderly fashion, but he just had his mobs just attack the Green Plateau every so often, just to weaken it, so that the Green Plateau couldn't rise to be too powerful. And one day, since it wasn't going fast enough, he sent in his goon Kronos to try to eliminate the Green Plateau entirely. But one of my friends in the Green Plateau, Kabuminator, actually killed Kronos. Kronos was King Ender's deputy. He actually used to be one of the Canayan dogs until he turned to King Ender's side. And now he's dead, killed by Kabuminator. So Ender's really shocked by this. So he gives Green Plateau some land to operate in. So the rule is we can do whatever we want in this land, but all the rest of the world belongs to Ender. So that's okay for now. But there are actually some rebel groups around the world. Like, remember the rebellion that was over here? Some of them took refuge in the Green Plateau territory. And I teamed up with them. And we started a big plot to get all of King Ender's troops to turn against him, so that the Ender Empire would collapse finally. So we go to the end, and we stage something. This is a picture from when that happened. So all the troops would turn against King Ender, and it worked. And then the Ender Empire collapsed. So now there's the Green Plateau here, and all this other territory left unoccupied. Now this is actually really great for the Green Plateau, because now that Ender's gone, all this land is free for us to take. So we make some colonies elsewhere in the world, villages. So some of it we take over from NPC villagers, but sometimes we just make villages by ourselves. And then we keep making more and more villages, and it's really fun. But then one day, the governor of this village, Village 11, wants to do whatever the hell he wants, and in the Green Plateau we don't allow that. We have laws, but he doesn't want to follow the laws, so he attacks the Green Plateau. and we ban him. But he's really good at hacking, and he hacks into the world. His name is KingdomCraft, by the way. You may have heard of him. So KingdomCraft hacks into the world and makes himself the owner, just like me. So eventually we agree that we would split up the server and we'd each get half of it. So he would occupy the south half, and I would occupy the north half. So this is the way it was supposed to work, and we would try to coexist peacefully. That did not work at all. KingdomCraft had a lot of spite for the Green Plateau and wanted to take over all of it. So what he did was we did have a few squabbles over some territory here, like the village that he used to own wasn't part of his territory, but he still wanted to keep it, so we had to take it back from him. And also, he occupied a lot of the far west that wasn't even belonging to him, so yeah, we basically were in full blast war, even though we tried not to. Also, he occupied the spawn, and this was a very good strategy for him because he was able to recruit new people. That anyone that joined the server, he would recruit them into his new plateau. So, and he also began to turn people in the Green Plateau against the Green Plateau to his Blue Plateau. My own deputy, KingdomCraft, actually turned to KingdomCraft's side in the Blue Plateau. So this had started a full-blown civil war between the two plateaus. Now KingdomCraft was now a new general of KingdomCraft's army, and he had a military plan. It was called KingdomCraft's March from the West, where he would march from the west over here and try to conquer everything until he reached the Green Plateau. So he did conquer a lot of stuff, but right over here we stopped him in the final battle. Now, something surprising happened though. After the final battle, KingdomCraft overthrew KingdomCraft and locked him in a prison cell, and then KingdomCraft took over as leader of the Blue Plateau and signed a peace treaty with the Green Plateau. So the treaty was basically the Blue Plateau could keep all the land that it took, but the Blue Plateau would now leave the Green Plateau alone, and we would indeed coexist peacefully, just like we had planned to earlier. And now that KingdomCraft and his aggressions were gone, locked in the cell, we were able to coexist peacefully, pretty much. And we agreed that these two territories would be neutral. We also drew boundaries everywhere to decide which land belongs to who. And eventually we started to develop more in our territories, because now we're not at war with each other, so we can afford to start developing more. And the territories that were owned by each of the villages, we now turned into provinces. Instead of numbers, they had names. So we had provinces everywhere. Also, you see this over here? They're a group of mercenaries that just came from the spawn and snuck over here. And this neutral territory isn't occupied by either of us, so they immediately take it over and make their own plateau, the Dark Plateau. And there's still the Green Plateau and the Blue Plateau. And we kind of see this Dark Plateau here, and we're mostly okay with it. So now there are 3 countries in the entire world, for a brief period of time. There's also the Montaigne tribe that's just been sitting here this whole time, not being affected by anything. And the Dark Plateau develops extremely quickly, probably the fastest growing civilization I've ever seen. And also, since they're mercenaries, KingdomCraft hires them to break him out of prison, and KingdomCraft tries to rise up again as the new leader of the Blue Plateau. So there's a quote-unquote peaceful meeting in the Dark Plateau, where all the 3 leaders of the plateaus meet. And in that quote-unquote peaceful meeting, KingdomCraft tries to poison me, but I recover from the poison, and while he's still gone to the Dark Plateau, I attack the Blue Plateau, and after that, and now that the Blue Plateau has collapsed, the Green Plateau is able to regain control of the entire world, because remember, the Dark Plateau is just a bunch of mercenaries. So now, there are 12 provinces all throughout the world, and we're developing really quickly. Now this becomes an era of success and economic prosperity, because we're developing so quickly. And everything and stuff, and we invent like currencies, and all the provinces began to trade with each other, and it goes great for a while. Also, remember this tribe, the Montaigne tribe that's just been sitting here doing nothing this whole time? Yeah, well, they finally attack Ravinia over here. Ravinia is one of the provinces. And they attack and destroy one of Ravinia's trading ports and capture and kill KingdomCraft, the governor of Ravinia. And we get really angry and immediately destroy the Montaigne tribe. And we also want to find out why the Montaigne tribe did this. But what we don't know is that they were actually commanded by a secret group of people from the dead called the Titans. Now the Titans exist in the lands of the dead, and they're made up of the worst criminals throughout Minecraft history. And their leader is Kronos, remember, the dog who turned to King Ender's side. And remember, he was killed by KingdomCraft, and then the KingdomCraft was just killed by the Montaigne tribe. So now, the Titans, as they're called, they want to come back to life, but they're trapped in the lands of the dead. So, the Montade tribe attacking Ravinia was actually part of their plan. So they knew that we would look for them in the pit, and we did. We did go to the pit to look for them, and they knew we'd try to get out. So we did get out, and they followed us out. So they did get out, but they didn't go to the overworld just yet. They just started to spread across the other dimensions of Minecraft. And also, after we attacked the Montane tribe, a lot of the other nomads around here that are not part of the Green Plateau territory are starting to get really suspicious of the Green Plateau, because remember, we took all this land and drove out all the animals. We didn't mean to, we just had to develop because of the Civil War, and after that, there was nothing we could do. But there's a bitter resentment of the Green Plateau and all the rest of the world, and a lot of the animals here begin to unite into semi-sort of tribes, just temporarily, just in case the Green Plateau tries to invade these lands too. Now, the Titans are spreading across the other dimensions, but remember, the Green Plateau is way more powerful than them, and we can easily take them out because we have so much stuff that we've acquired over the years. So more of these groups keep forming, and we actually don't know what's going on outside the Green Plateau. We're just focused on developing ourselves, which is currently going great. But then, one day, some of the Titans land in the overworld, and they occupy some land and make it their own. Now, once the Green Plateau figures out about this, we immediately rush in to try to attack them. But before we can, one of the Titans, Celine, goes into the place where all our modded data, because remember this is a modded server, is kept, and she manages to take out all the mods and destroy, she basically hacked into the world by physically going into the place where the mod data is kept and deleting all of it. So now everything that was modded, all our modded resources, are now gone. And almost all our resources were modded, so now the Green Plateau is suddenly weakened because a lot of our resources are gone. And the Titans, remember all these groups have a bitter hatred of the Green Plateau, the Titans promise to help these people fight off us, because the Titans have them convinced that we're evil. So then the Titans spread super quickly around the world and make provinces of their own. So the Titans' goal is to take over the world from us and become the new leaders of Minecraft. And we know that the Titans are evil and have crazy plans, so we have to stop them. And the Titan capital is over here, and it's ruled by Kronos. Remember, he's the lead Titan and everything. So the Titans start invading our land. They take over the province Durlan, and a few other places too. They tried to take over Tridonia as well, but we sort of managed to hold them off. Now, we think they're just trying to take over all of our territories one by one. But what they really want is just to get into the Green Plateau capital over here and steal the code, because the code for the server is kept in here. Steal the code for the server, just like they did with stealing the codes for the mods over here. They want to steal the code for the server so that they can hack into the server and change all the rules to make it their own. So that's how they will really gain ownership of the entire world. But we don't know that. We're just fighting them for territory. So then they begin to take even more territory. Remember, they connect all this territory by taking over here and here and here, so they can have a big ring around us. And also when they took over Durlan, it kind of cut off this part from this part. And one thing they do is they attack Ravinia from two fronts and take that over. And New Relic is a really weak province, so they can take over that pretty easily too. And then, right after that, we think all hope is lost because the Titan army is crazy strong and it keeps getting stronger. But then, right over here, in Navaket, we discover a secret underground base that the Blue Plateau had built when it was still a thing. Actually, it's a big network of underground bases with so many resources inside it. What's important about these resources is that these resources are from vanilla Minecraft, not modded Minecraft. So we take all these resources, and Navaket develops a military of its own based on all those resources that it just got from those secret underground bases. Now, the Titans still have a lot of land around the Green Plateau capital, which is pretty scary for us. And then they invade the Green Plateau capital just so that they can take the server code. Right after they take the server code, they already have what they need. So they pull out all their troops from all these places and just focus on defending their capital long enough for them to develop the code enough to take over the server. But right before they do, we sneak in disguised as mobs, disable their code from being used, and finally defeat the Titans and kill their leader, Kronos. So yeah, this is where we just last left off in the last episode of Green Plateau. So the Green Plateau has restored control to the Green Plateau, basically. And yeah, this is where I pass on my leadership to Vaporizer, who's this guy who killed Kronos, finally. And yeah, and after that is when I left the Green Plateau. So what happens after this?
So now there's world peace. Just kidding, Durlan wants to leave the plateau too, because its governor, Esquire, was actually a traitor during the Titan War and sided with the Titans. When I left the plateau, I left this guy, Vaporizer, in charge, but he was rivals with Esquire, so he tried to put him on trial and get him sent to jail. So Esquire fled to his home province of Durlan and had his province break away into a separate country so that he could escape going to jail. Vaporizer wanted the Green Plateau to invade Durlan to bring Esquire back and put him on trial again, but the rest of the plateau didn't really want to fight because they were tired from the Titan War. But then when Vaporizer lost the next election, he united all the western provinces, which were the only ones he cared about anyway, into the Empire of Iapeta, and then Esquire was leader of the Empire of Durlan. So there were now two rival empires. Now, what about these provinces, Tridonia and Malgazan, which are now cut off from the rest of the Green Plateau? The Green Plateau was getting really weak because their most successful provinces had all left. And the Green Plateau was getting more and more run by animals, like Minecraft animals, rather than players. Iapeta was now the only country that was entirely run by players. Durlan and Navaket were run by a mix of players and animals, and the Green Plateau was increasingly being led by animals because it was just getting less successful and more players were leaving. So once the Green Plateau decided they weren't going to bother governing these provinces anymore because they didn't have anyone to do it, the two empires of Iapeta and Durlan went to war over them. At first Durlan was winning, but then they started losing, and once they started losing, Esquire became a radical Durlan extremist terrorist and began bombing cities all over the world. But then the governor of this province, Estherland, left the plateau and joined Durlan so she could take over Durlan. She staged a coup d'etat against Esquire because he was insane and sent him to jail, and she became the next Empress of Durlan, and she was willing to surrender to Iapeta. But Estherland was the last remaining successful province of the Green Plateau, so after they left, the plateau completely fell apart. All the remaining provinces became their own independent countries run by Minecraft animals, and after about 20 years, the rest of the land owned by the plateau was divided up amongst the rest of the nations. So now there were 3 big empires and a bunch of smaller animal nations. So now there's a bunch of countries, but more countries means more trade, so now there's a golden age of trade. Durlan sold off some of their land to different countries, and Navaket decided to give its local cities more independence so they can develop themselves and trade more. At first this was a good idea, but then it backfired. You see, Navaket was great at fighting, but not great at governing. They were very incompetent and inefficient. So once the cities got some independence, they started to want more. The first people to try and break away were in the region of Ravinia, which was historically rivals with Navaket, and was only occupied by Navaket because Navaket liberated them from the Titans in the Titan War. But now they wanted independence, so they fought a war for independence. While they were fighting, some other regions like Versha and Manplatin were able to just slip away, but Navaket still wasn't letting Ravinia go free, so Ravinia invaded Navaket itself to send a message, and then Navaket finally got their act together and sent a general to retake what Ravinia had taken from them, and then they let Ravinia go free. But then that Navakeshan general decided to break away and turn the land that he had just retaken into his own personal country. So after that, things were really over for Navaket. Even Ravinia didn't stay united because people couldn't agree on who owned what, so every city became an independent city-state, and eventually by the year 8200, every city in the whole empire became independent. The once mighty Empire of Navaket had split into 20 different tiny city-states. Now, the trade economy in these countries is still pretty good, but with the empire gone, Durlan is now the most powerful empire, and they have a very aggressive empress named Funoa, who thinks previous emperors were stupid for selling off Durlan's land. She starts building military cities and training the animals of Durlan to fight to conquer other countries, because she believes in this autistic racial hierarchy of the different ethnicities of Minecraft animals. She starts by invading these countries, which have a lot of resources but aren't strong enough to defend themselves. They are allied with Kanaya, so she invades Kanaya and enlists the help of Sanama to also invade Kanaya. So things are going pretty well for her because she's fighting a bunch of weaker animal nations. Durlan was hoping to sell the resources they got to these countries, but they don't actually like the fact that Durlan's invading sovereign nations, so they all boycott Durlan, which is the opposite of what Durlan wanted. So to teach them a lesson, Durlan invades them as well. They're hoping that if they can conquer most of these countries, they can force the other countries to trade with them. Durlan rapidly invades these three small countries and even invades Thiro by sea, before getting repelled. Durlan has the capital of Genesis surrounded with their tanks, but somehow Genesis survives. Now, Genesis is the one Christian country, so they think it's a miracle that they survived, but Empress Funoa doesn't think so. She thinks they secretly had help from Iapeta, and that Iapeta was the source of her failures all along. So she thinks by invading Iapeta, she can win the whole war, so she invades Iapeta. But now she's fighting a war on 3 fronts, so the more she pushes on one front, the more the countries on other fronts begin to push back, and it starts to all collapse. So Stormlord, the new emperor of Iapeta, made a plan with all these other countries to all invade Durlan at the same time, and once they did that, it was over for Durlan. They burned down Durlan's military city of Zidiotropolis, Empress Funoa fled, and then Durlan surrendered to all these other countries. After gaining a lot of new land, Genesis went from a tiny city-state to a pretty powerful Christian kingdom. Jernaya and Thero have a brief underground war over mining territory, and Jernaya wins. These 3 countries are still run by military generals from the Navake Empire, until the citizens get sick of them and overthrow them, so the 3 of them unite into the Navakeshan Confederation. Manplatin wants to take back the city of Manplatin from Hyperland, but they're only strong enough to take half, and then they pay Hyperland to not try and take it back. So Hyperland just steals some stuff from Hanakwa instead. Kaulia's sacrificing babies, and Genesis doesn't like that, so they invade them until they stop. Durlan's finally strong enough to go to war again, so they attack Iapeta and try and take back some of the land they lost in the previous war. But this time they're fighting slow and steady and not taking on too many enemies at once. Durlan realized they needed some allies this time, so they funded the creation of a new empire in the east, named after the old Distan Empire. Now, the Navake Empire kind of was a new Distan Empire, but this empire wasn't really that. It was just a bunch of rich villagers with a secret town hidden in the mountains that would pay some poor countries to join them, and they were going to pay Durlan for some weapons to take over some less poor countries. Durlan also gets Kanaya on their side, which is very useful because Kanaya owns the Nether, and the Nether update just happened, so now the Nether has lots of gold and netherite, both of which are very useful. And because Kanaya gets so rich in gold, they crash the global economy because the price of gold becomes worthless. So now Durlan's confident enough to go back to war with Iapeta and take back even more land. But this leads to an arms race between Durlan and Iapeta where they keep trying to make fancier and fancier weapons. Durlan gets access to the Death Star, and Emperor Stormlord of Iapeta goes to Vinter, which is run by a crazy mad scientist, so he can get a laser cannon to push back against Durlan. Vinter agrees because they're being attacked by the new Distan Empire, which is now mostly just called the Claytonian Empire, and it's expanding rapidly. They convince Rija to join them because Rija is being excluded by the other members of the Navakeshan Confederation, who see this as a big betrayal. So now that Claytonia is even more powerful, Durlan goes ahead and takes back almost all the land that they had lost from Iapeta. Claytonia is pretty strong now, but they covet the wealth and trade of the Navakeshan Confederation. So they invade the Navakeshan Confederation, which now has more members because they need allies. And they do pretty well at first, but they get stalled with a long siege of Jernaya. But once Jernaya falls, it's over for the Confederation. Meanwhile, Durlan is trying to finally invade the capital city of Iapeta, but then it's revealed that the leaders of both Durlan and Iapeta were secretly conspiring with each other to draw out the war as long as possible so they could both stay in power. So once that's discovered, the war is over between Durlan and Iapeta. The last Navakeshan holdouts are in Manplatin, but the second Manplatin gets a little bit invaded, they surrender to Claytonia. The aftermath of the Claytonio-Durlan War, as it ends up being called, is a global dark age for about 200 years. Durlan and Iapeta have lost all patriotism after being scammed by their emperors, Kanaya crashed the global economy, and Claytonia eliminated the greatest economic powerhouses in the region. So it's a time of great crime, chaos, and economic stagnation. Mobs come back from the far reaches of the world after previously being banished. Not much happened during the time period after the war, except for a brief revolt of one of the states of Durlan. The only real winner from the war was Claytonia, and they weren't really invested in building up a powerful empire. It was mostly run by greedy bankers who wanted to keep expanding their wealth, so they conquered the final remaining competing nations in the eastern region. In the 8400s, something new happens. Since everyone's broke, the country of Australis wants to harvest resources in the north, but the native sheep nomads don't like that very much, and some of them stage a revolt. The sheep nomads had lived for thousands of years as an ethnic group in the wild regions of the middle of the continent, separated from most other civilizations that discriminated against sheep. Rebel communities of sheep kept popping up, so the government of Australis occupied the entire region, but the sheep nomads still kept conquering stuff and winning battles. The reason for this is that to defend themselves over the centuries, the sheep nomads developed a karate-like fighting technique that only relies on fists and sticks. The sheep nomads all over the region heard about this and, no pun intended, flocked to their cause, so they kept expanding more and more. Durlan heard about this new nation of Koilar and devised a clever plan. They helped Koilar conquer the rest of the region, and even gave Koilar a huge chunk of their land that contained some sheep nomads, and helped Koilar achieve their dreams of conquering all the regions that contained native sheep nomads. Why was Durlan being so generous? Well, they could see that Koilar had the best fighters in the land even without weapons, and were much more deadly when they had good weapons, but they could also see that the Koilaris were a bunch of nomadic brutes who couldn't really lead themselves in any sophisticated government. So Durlan was planning to use Koilar as a puppet state, as cannon fodder to invade Iapeta so they could finally get back at Iapeta. Unfortunately, Koilar figured out what they were doing, so they invaded Durlan and it quickly fell. The northern regions were full of camps where Durlan held prisoner animals to harvest for food. That's the only way they could get food from animals since it was a mixed nation of players and animals. But Koilar liberated them, so the northern region of Durlan became the nation of Baserico. The fall of Durlan was a huge shock to the rest of the world, and it plunged the economy into an even deeper dark age because Durlan had been the breadbasket of the world for centuries. But it led to something that signaled the end of the Dark Age. The idea that a bunch of natives could rise up and take down a mighty empire gave hope to these people on this island off the coast of Regia. You might remember Regia as the small country that betrayed the Navakeshan Confederation, allowing them to be conquered by the Empire of Claytonia. Well, they began to revolt against Claytonia. They tell the rest of the cities of Navaket it's time to rise up with them, so each city produces its own private militia and they unite to liberate Navaket. Navaket begins liberating Manplatin, but the Platins don't really want to fight, so they strike a deal with Claytonia and once again buy their independence, which makes Navaket see them as really pathetic. So Claytonia's biggest sources of income just left, so they need a new one. They turn their eyes southward to the country of Zavisio. For most of its existence it was a poor country run by terrorist groups, but they just got very rich and successful after being the first country to learn how to mine the new types of stone after the new cave update. So Claytonia invades Zavisio and conquers their stone mining fields, which makes sense because Zavisio used to be a colony of the ancient Distan Empire. This colony is called Petria, which means stone, and it becomes the main source of income for the empire. But after about a generation, Petria doesn't want to be taxed by Claytonia since they're doing just fine on their own, so they break free and quickly conquer almost the entire rest of the continent that they're on. After that massive L, Claytonia pretty much just collapses. Also, Iapeta is too controlled by elites in the cities, so the players in the rural areas start a civil war and take over the entire empire. They organize it into a bunch of strict provinces and want to have a much more centralized government, but Nuclea doesn't want anything to do with that, so they break free, because nobody can invade Nuclea. Kainaya has a civil war too, and splits over whether to follow the secular parliament or the pagan religious monarchy. During the war, Australis supported North Kainaya, but these islands supported South Kainaya, so they split off into the Republic of Tectona, which is basically a country run by pirates. How's the new government of Iapeta going? Not well. Turns out a bunch of Minecraft players don't want to be part of a bureaucratic government. They lose control over the region of Malgazan, and all the mobs start flocking to there as they're receding from the other countries as the Dark Age is coming to a close. Minlia and Thero finally reunite into the Kingdom of Ravinia. That took them long enough. And yay, Durlan's back, or at least a union of states that used to make up Durlan, except this one wants to do its own thing for a while, that's okay. So that is where we are right now. So let's go to this bigger map because more land is about to be discovered. Remember Tectona, the country of pirates? For centuries, they'd been getting sold illegal items by the free pirates, such as gunpowder, spider eyes, tridents, and phantom membranes. Very valuable items, but they had been illegal when Tectona was part of Australis because Australis believes in mob rights, and you have to kill mobs to get these items. But now that Tectona is a free pirate country, they begin colonizing these islands to find out where the pirates are getting these items. And when they do that, they accidentally discover a brand new continent. Turns out tons of mobs live on this continent. They call it Satripa and colonize colonize it so they can harvest the mobs for resources. Their rival country, Australis, finds out what they're doing and also colonizes Satripa. They find a few native Satripan animal tribes that were brought there from Klas Kol in a Noah's Ark type thing by the final leader of the Green Plateau in 8140 just after it collapsed. Australis teams up with the natives and colonizes all the land they occupy. Then they have a war with Tectona for control over the continent. The native Satripans are backed by Australis, and the mobs are backed by Tectona. Eventually, they just kind of split it. Since Australis can't have all of Satripa, they look for more land. They traced the path of that Green Plateau leader and found that his ship landed here, on an entirely new continent. So Australis settles there and makes a few small colonies there. Turns out most of it is an icy wonderland. It's like the Antarctica of the KingdomCraft world. But turns out it's hard to manage all these colonies, but they don't want to lose any of these colonies to Tectona, so instead they sell these new colonies on this new continent to their friends, Klas Kol and North Kenaya. North Kenaya begins colonizing more and more of this continent, and calls it Elavastra. They make many villages along the coast because it's too cold to go further south right now, and they connect them all by a nice big train. Tectona responds by colonizing even more islands in the Great Ocean. These two countries are doing things the Christian country of Genesis doesn't like. Plata is segregating this poor people group, the Vertians, into very poor ghettos, and Kaulia sacrifices babies for experience orbs in their jungle temples. So Genesis leads civil rights movements in both of these countries. Once they're successful, both of these countries convert to Christianity and join the kingdom of Genesis. After island hopping, Tectona discovers a new landmass and a long-lost tribe that's been minding its own business since before the days of King Ender. They sell the landmass to their friends, South Kenaya, who teams up with this tribe, Bialvashar, because it turns out this tribe has always been Kenaias, just like South Kenaya. The Iapetan players want more land to play in, so they colonize Canalia. These three countries are now awake to the colonization frenzy. They all want a piece of this new continent Dvorica, so they start making small colonies, and it kind of works, but Iapeta just takes everything over, because these are not strong countries, and Iapeta is made of players, so they can beat almost anyone. But Iapeta still probably couldn't beat all the southern powers at once, which have gotten really wealthy and powerful due to their colonies. So instead, Iapeta turns them on each other, and then takes over all their colonies, leaving all the southern powers poor and full of seething rage against Iapeta. So now Iapeta owns half the world, and Australis is too broke to care about the conflict in its northern regions, so it lets the north become a semi-autonomous republic called Karaida. Karaida immediately falls into civil war between conservatives, who want to basically join the country of Klas Kol, and progressives who want greater involvement with the national government of Australis. Multiple countries begin supporting each side. In the midst of the Karaidan civil war, a Karaidan sheep, Tragedus Zakremvin, goes to Genesis, converts to Christianity, and tries to convert Karaida to Christianity, but it fails and he dies. But after he dies, his writings get circulated in Iapeta, and the animals of Iapeta convert to Christianity, overthrow the empire, and make the entire empire of Iapeta a Christian empire. Since Iapeta is an empire of players, they invite Christian players from all over the world to join the server and join the empire. Because this gets promoted on a famous Christian YouTuber's channel, there's a massive influx of players into the server. The server's population of players increases by over 1,000% in just one Minecraft year. Since the animals who took over the government of Iapeta were Presbyterian, since they had been taught about Christianity by Presbyterian players centuries ago, Iapeta is a Presbyterian nation, and they let Presbyterians build in the town of Borealis. But many Christian players who are joining are not Presbyterian. Genesis had already been operating kind of like an Anglican church for centuries, since they had a national church structure with bishops, so they become Anglican, and they invite all the Anglicans to come build in Genesis. But Genesis also wants to integrate as many other players as possible as long as they can fit it into their episcopal system. The Diocese of Manplatin becomes Roman Catholic because the Platin people have always seen themselves as first among equals. The Diocese of Palamia is Eastern Orthodox because the jungle culture has a mysticism kind of like Eastern Orthodoxy. The Diocese of Vertia becomes Methodist because the Vertians have struggled with oppression for a long time, and Methodists are very good at dealing with that. The region of Qadiyya used to be part of Genesis, but they were not Christian because they wanted to keep their identity distinct from Genesis. But now that they're free from Genesis, they're okay with being Christian as long as it's a distinct kind of Christianity from Genesis. So they become Lutheran and convince the entire kingdom of Ravenia to become Lutheran, so they can be distinct from Genesis but also be Christian. Their best friends are the country of Nuclea, who also becomes Lutheran. Lutherans don't like Presbyterians, and Nuclea doesn't like Iapeta, so it works out perfectly. The Western Confederation over here isn't exactly a country, just a union of states, and Genesis and Qualar go to war over who can influence these states more. Genesis is Christian and Qualar is Canaist, which is a type of Minecraft paganism. Some of the states become Christian, some of the states become Canaist, and some reject religion altogether due to the conflict. The states that become Christian are just vaguely Christian with no denominational affiliation, so they become home for a lot of Baptist and non-denominational Christian players. The one player who joins the Grand Duchy of Chemastonik is actually Moravian, so Chemastonik becomes Moravian. It becomes very clear to all the animal nations that converting to Christianity and inviting players is very economically beneficial, since players can build much more, a lot faster, and get a lot more resources. Some countries don't want to entirely become Christian, but they still want the economic benefits. Like Navaket lets one of their towns become Christian, it becomes Congregationalist, because everything in Navaket is very locally run, just like Congregationalism. Iapeta is Presbyterian, but Dutch Reformed is close enough, so they can live in Camperland if they want. Also, all the southern nations completely reject Christianity. Some are Canaist, some are secular, some are cultish, but what unites all of them is hating Christianity because they hate anything that has to do with players ever since players stole all of their colonies. They used to have lots of rivalries between each other when they were successful, but now they're all becoming friends, and they're going to economically stagnate for the next 300 years or so because they're rejecting the players. So players keep flooding into the server, and countries are running out of space for them. Iapeta owns tons of mining lands that are just for mining, not for building or living, and they rent out the mining lands to players of other countries. But because these other countries are running out of space, players of all denominations begin to form little civilizations in the mining lands, even though they're not supposed to, and there's no protection from griefing or stealing in these mining lands. They start New Nicaea over here. They start Fryland over here, which is supposed to be a place of liberty from the law. They start Shroomland over here, which is so crazy it requires a bunch of private military to protect it. Iapeta becomes jealous of how much development is happening outside its official territory, so they let the western part of its official territory become a free mining land as well, and it's a smashing success. In Satripa, Presbyterians and Catholics collaborate to make a beautiful civilization. Let's hope that lasts. So now the Empire of Iapeta is at its peak. They just finished their capital city of Presbytopolis, they own half the world, and they are insanely wealthy. But the colonies are still cesspools of crime and griefing, so the central government tries to assert its authority over them and enforce the rules, and then Fryland revolts. Turns out they like their anarchy, and they begin conquering some of Iapeta's mining lands. They're winning the war because they have a lot of players on their side, but having their own military makes Fryland even more chaotic, and eventually their original territory falls into complete disrepair. So then they begrudgingly admit they need a government. They build Christosia, which is an Eastern Orthodox kingdom, and then all the Orthodox people from Palamia migrate there. After that, Iapeta gives up trying to manage its colonies and instead sells them off to other countries. These colonies have lots of Catholics, but they're collapsing due to lawlessness, so the Catholics flock to this piece of land they bought from Petria and build New Rome. After that, the colonies collapse, and Auria is able to get back their old colony from Iapeta. Remember how Iapeta let its western regions be a free mining land? Well, now those regions have more players than the rest of Iapeta, and the players vote to reject Presbytopolis and set up Titan Bay as the new capital city. So now this is Iapeta, but the Presbyterians want to stay strictly Presbyterian, so they become the new country of Tridonia, and their new capital is this old creepy city, Noxus. Noxus invites the leaders of all the Christian animal nations to the Council of Noxus to decide what to do about the player crisis. The president of Tridonia, a fox named Charles Hedge, says it's time to kick out all the players and let most of them live in the colonies. Picarda has a colony, so they let the Oriental Orthodox live there. The Nestorians follow them there, but they get kicked out and move to the wilderness. Expulsionism is now in full force, with players leaving animal nations. They don't really mind, since they can have a lot more freedom in the colonies, but they do leave all the wealth and resources behind in the animal nations. The Catholic players leave Manplatin and move to Petria, which converts to Catholicism, and with the players gone, Manplatin begins to revert back to Anglicanism. The Baptist players move to Iapeta, which becomes Baptist. Genesis has a colony called Albion, so the Anglican players all move there. Auria changes its name to Relica to be more historic and invites the Methodists to move to their colony, which they call Sanctum. Tridonia has one colony left, so the Presbyterian players move to Satripa, which they rename Covenantia, and kick out all the Catholics who move to Petria. This colony ends up being pretty poor. The Western Confederation lets the Dutch Reformed have their colony, which they call Kyperia. The Lutheran players actually stay in Nuclea, but they also settle their colony of Concordia. A bunch of Presbyterians convert to Orthodoxy and build lots of stuff in Nikopol, but many of them don't stay Orthodox for long. Christosia has a lot of non-denominationals that are just LARPing as Orthodox, so eventually they stop LARPing and declare their independence and become the non-denominational country of Ballygowan. So now most players are out of the animal nations. A few of them stay, but only if they're very wealthy. The most successful nations are now Christosia and Petria. They begin recolonizing their old mining lands from which they emerged. The Vertian animals, who are Methodist, leave Genesis and start New Vertia. That land belonged to the ancient Relica Empire, and modern Relica has ties to Methodists, so they decide to unite into one country. This inspires people to resettle the old lands of the Claytonian Empire. They used to be uninhabitable, but now technology's better. North Canaya builds a secular cathedral of philosophy to show off and be like the Christian countries without being Christian. But then Manplatin rebels against Genesis because they want to stay Catholic, and the Petrian military backs them up and conquers the secular cathedral of philosophy along the way, Christianizing it. So now North Canaya is really pissed. Koilar invades the Western Confederation again, and they're about to win because they're really good warriors. So the Western Confederation cries for help to the players in Kyperia, and a bunch of Dutch Reformed players led by Dutch Reformer liberates the Western Confederation, unites all the states into Durlan, and builds beautiful Dutch Reformed churches everywhere. This inspires other players to begin returning to the original animal nations. Nuclea is becoming an empire, so they take over Ravinia, and they go to war with Petria over this tiny piece of land in the desert. Malgazan just colonized a crap ton of land. I hope they don't do anything bad with it. Genesis gains a bit of land back from Petria, but loses some land to Durlan. Klaskol's government has been fake for centuries, but Australis wants to support it anyway, so the tribal kingdoms that really run the place take over and rebel against Klaskol. Now that Klaskol's gone, Malgazan owns Malgazan again, yay! Also, most of the animal nations are now hijacked by villagers who worship the pink sheep. In preparation for the return of the pink sheep, Malgazan unites all the southern countries in a crusade against Christendom. They want to retake their old colonies from the Christian countries. You might ask, if they're so poor, how are they going to beat the Christian countries? Remember, the animal nations that have all the money are hijacked and they worship the pink sheep, so they willingly support the southern nations conquering their own colonies. After about 5 years of war, all the colonies fall. Let's see if Christendom can retake them before the pink sheep comes back.